Hi guys, today we're going to be looking at the brand new version of Construction Lines, which is version 0.9.5. It's released already and you should be able to download from Blender Market or Gumroad. I'll put links in the description below. If you've previously bought, you should be able to upgrade either through an email that's sent to you or just log into your account on either one of those sites, and you should be able to download from there. So quite a bit to go through. We've got a new toolbar to look at, new selection mode, rotations, horizontal guides, direction constraints, a new global axis snapping, and a few other bits to talk about too. So let's take a look. We jump into Blender and we'll click on Construction Lines. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is this brand new toolbar, which mainly replaces the old context menu. The context menu is still there, but it's mainly centered around guide operations. You can exit from here and you can also create a face, but most of the tools here are for guides specifically. Looking along the toolbar, we have a selection mode, which we'll talk about in a minute, the measure guide tool, line drawing, rectangle, circle and arc tools. We've got our move tool, and now we've got these two extra rotate and face extrude, which we'll go through in just a moment. We also have another exit button, which allows you to exit construction lines. And you'll notice under each one in brackets, you also have the hotkey. And on the exit, we've got Shift plus Escape, which is a bit of a change because before it was Escape to end the operation and then Escape again to exit construction lines. I've changed that now so that you don't accidentally leave the tool. So you can still press the exit button or use the context menu exit, or use Shift Escape, or simply pick one of the other tools and you'll immediately quit out of construction lines. So the first thing I want to look at is the new selection tool, which has really opened the way for quite a lot of new features, and a couple in particular in this version, but in later versions I'll be adding more that use this feature, and it brings it more into line with the way Blender works. So I can select objects singly, or pressing Control I can select multiple objects, which allows me to choose a tool like Move and it applies to all selected objects, which we couldn't do in the past. It was just a case of being able to move the closest object or the clicked object. Just a quick note on these, on both Move and Rotate, and in fact also Extrude. If you don't select anything, they will just select the closest object, so you don't have to go and select each time. You can just hit the Move tool and select the closest one. What's quite handy about being able to select an object to work on is that you can now do things like take the Move tool, and instead of being limited as you were before to the snap points on the object itself to start from, you can now start your move from a distance on another object. So you might click a point over on this object, this cube here, and now you can use this as a guide, if you will. And maybe if you had an arc, you could then snap around that arc on your movement. And that sort of thing also works with rotation. You can rotate from a distance as well, and I'll show you that. So looking at rotation then, if I quickly skip back into Blender, as I mentioned in the last video, if you're new to Blender, the way rotations work are that if I hit the R key, I'll limit to the Z axis. All rotations take place around a specified pivot point. but you have to set that. So that might be the center of your geometry here. It might be the 3D cursor or a bounding box or some other point, but you have to go and set that. And if you wanted to say have your pivot point on somewhere on this cube over here, you would have to select that point, move the 3D cursor over, then come up here, set to the 3D cursor your pivot point, and then do your rotation. Whereas now, with construction lines, if my object's already selected here, if I hit rotate, my first click is going to be that pivot point. It's automatically set to that point now, and then I simply choose the plane on which I want to rotate. I'll click my second point, and then I'm free to rotate, and I can use the x-axis, y-axis, or head back to the z-axis. And I might want to select this object, and instead of having my pivot point on this corner, I might want it over here. So I can quite easily do that. That's already automatically set this pivot point. Click my second point, and there you go. I can rotate around that point there. I can also do multiple object rotation, so I can select two objects or more using control, select my first point, and then we can rotate both of them. And if I hit enter, just like any other tool, it enters me into the input mode, and then I'll type, in this instance, maybe 45 for 45 degrees, and then hit enter again. And that sets my objects rotated exactly at 45 degrees. So this is a great new feature, and I'm really pleased that I've got this in here now. You can rotate objects, multiple objects, and you can also rotate guides. If we undo this, if we head back to the we head to the guide tool, and I'll put a new guide in. You can now select guides, and you can move them around, which you couldn't before, and you can set them to any point you want. You can also, if you click one of the ends, you can just move the end of the guide to anywhere that you want to. And you can also, just as you can with the objects, you can rotate the guide in any way that you would like. So that's really handy when you want to set out normally something at an angle. You rotate that guide and set the angles to start building your objects from. That's something I use fairly frequently in other bits of software. Now, another feature, as we're on the subject of guides, I jump into top view. I'll select my guide here, and off of an edge, if I start to build a new guide and I hit Alt, that will turn the guide into a horizontal guide. And if I click just as normal, I now have a horizontal guide that I can snap to. And the same off of any edge, we can now have horizontal guides set. And what's really nice is that included now is, if guides intersect, you now have a snappable intersect point that we can work from. So you can now work from that point. So as we're in top view, I want to show you this new feature, which is the ability to lock to any direction. So whereas previously you could sort of do a soft lock, a snap to various directions, which would automatically happen, or you could hit X, Y, or Z to lock. You couldn't lock to any of the snapped directions, but pressing Shift now locks to that direction. And that's not limited to any particular direction. You can literally choose any direction. It might be a perpendicular direction, hit shift, and that is now locked to that direction. And then you hit shift again, and that will take that lock off. I'm just looking at my screencast keys here. I don't know why it's not showing the shift, or it's not registering the shift, but that is what's happening. I'm pressing shift there. Another new feature that I've included, which you might have seen whilst I've been moving around, is that you can now snap to the global axes. They're treated like edges now. And again, if I go into top view, I can now start building guides, maybe horizontal guides, straight off of these axes. And this is really handy, especially when you're starting out a scene and you've not modelled anything yet, and you want to set your space out and your dimensions. Instead of just working from the 3D cursor as we did before, you can now work off of these axes. If I head back into Blender, you'll notice that I don't have the Z-axis showing. So if I pop that on, head back into construction lines, and you'll notice that now that is snappable. So if the axis is visible, if it's set as an overlay, you can snap to it. And you can also turn that off in preferences. So I head over to preferences, go to construction lines, it's over. We've got this option here to snap to global axes, and you can turn that off or on depending on whether you want to have that on or off. So as we're here, you will notice we also have the default tool, which is a new preference, and this allows you to set the tool that's going to be active when you start construction lines. It's defaulted to the tape, but you can set it to any of these other tools that you like, which is useful if you particularly use a tool each time that you start. You have to change to it. You no longer need to change to it. It's defaulted to that. So I might want to always start in line if that's what you normally use. Now these are the same here. Actually, the default circle and arc segments is new, so you can now set that segment number. And also I've added the horizontal guide length. So I've set this to 100 here. If I head back into construction lines and zoom right out, you'll notice that there is an end to these lines, unlike some programs that they're a continuous, never-ending line. Here they do have an end. And this will work absolutely fine at any scale. So if you're working very, very small, you may want to bring that size down, or if you're working particularly large, maybe you're drawing up a whole building, you might want to increase the size of these. And this works off of the units that you're currently using. So I'd set it to 100, I'm working in metric, so that will be 100 meters that's set to. So along with the new features, there's also a couple of new improvements, which I'll show you now. The first is that objects selected in normal Blender mode will be carried through to construction lines, so they will remain selected, meaning that you don't need to reselect them. And it just means that things are a lot smoother as you're working between modes. And also with that, if, for instance, you're in edit mode and you've changed selection mode and then entered construction lines, those modes will be returned to what you had them at once you return. The other change that you'll notice is that we now have face centers. which is very useful when you're splitting faces. I select the line tool here, I split this face, and it means that you can very quickly and easily see that that operation has worked, and you now have two new face centers because you've got two new faces. The final new tool to look at is the face extrude. Now, I hadn't planned to develop this because along with a lot of other people, I was waiting for the Blender extrude manifold feature to come out, which it did in, I can't remember, it was the last version of the version before that. And we'd hoped that we would be able to cut through meshes, but that's not been the case, and I think there's a few issues with it. So I've sort of done a stopgap function which allows you to cut through meshes. I'd suggest probably for other extrude functions to use what Blender already has, but this should get us through that problem until they fix it, if they're going to fix it. So I'll show you this quickly. In edit mode, if I draw, say, a rectangle on a face to split the face, I can now select that face and cut all the way through that face. And in the same way, I can draw some random shape and then cut all the way through that mesh, and maybe cut through that way as well. It's limited, but it will get us through those issues of cutting through windows or doors that Blender's own extrude can't currently do. So I'll keep developing this as long as Extrude Manifold doesn't fix these issues, but once it does, I'll probably retire this from the tool set there. So the final feature or change that I want to talk about is the face creation, which was a feature before. It's still in the context menu, but the way you select the vertice points is slightly different. So now in select mode we hold Shift and Control, and then we can select the points that we want and either press F or click the Create Face. So it works the same way, it's just slightly different in the way you do selections. There's a couple of known issues. One of them is with Extrude. The way that I have built the tool, it's all based around the Boolean operations that Blender has, and I tend to use for most of the operations the exact solver, which is quite new, and I think there's a few issues with it. Sometimes it leaves little bits of the mesh behind which might need to be cleaned up at some point if that happens, but in general it works quite smoothly and certainly works for cutting through meshes. The other issue is and I've had quite a bit of contact about this with people saying that when they install or update construction lines, the random errors just pop up when they try and either enable or start construction lines, and the simple fix to this is just to restart Blender. I don't know why it happens, and it particularly happens on Mac computers, but the fix is to restart. I'll keep looking into it, but the errors don't really mean anything, so it's hard to narrow this one down, but as I say, just restart Blender and they will be fine. Now, moving forward from this version and looking towards version 1 and hopefully coming out of beta, I have a list now, and I'll post this along with the release notes, of the features that I would like to include for version 1. And that doesn't mean the development's going to stop. but these were always the things that I wanted to have for a first version, and I'll go through these quickly now. The first one is an auto array feature. So at the moment in Blender, as anyone who has used Blender for a while will know, that you can add an array modifier. Let's just stretch this out slightly, increase the number, to duplicate your objects and space them apart. However, in other pieces of software, maybe in things like SketchUp, you can simply grab the object, holding Control, move it to a location, and once you set that final location, you can either do something like ×3, and that will create 3 objects with that exact spacing that you've put there, or you can move the object much further away and hit the divide button, and it will divide that space and duplicate the objects within that space. And it's a very accurate way of spacing objects out, and it's a lot more straightforward than setting up an array and working out the distance yourself. So I would like to include that. The other function that I would like to have, or feature, is in edit mode. I would like to be able to use some of the tools that we've got here, like rotate and move, which you can't currently. They only work at an object level, so I'd like to include those, and also the ability to copy and paste and have construction lines auto attach though that geometry once it's pasted in, and that would also create any faces that would be created once extra geometry is sort of attached to it. A feature that I might include is multi-face extrude, but that so depends on where Blender take extrude manifold, whether that is going to be continue to be developed further, or whether it's going to stick where it is at the moment. If it's not going to be developed further so that we can cut through, then I will have to keep extrude, and I will add in multi-face extrudes. The next one is guide to edge intersection. So obviously we have guide to guide intersections, as I showed you earlier, but also I would love to be able to have a guide to edge. So at this point here we should have an intersection for the guide to edge. And I didn't include it this time, although I did work on it a bit, because it's quite intensive on the calculations. So it was slowing things down a bit, so I need to optimize that before I put it into a release. But that will be there. I will have edge guide intersections, and possibly even an option to have object or face intersections, those kind of things, but they would probably be optional preferences and not on all the time. We'll see how that goes. So the next item on my list is the ability to select and delete individual guides. So at the moment you can delete all guides, but I want to be able to just select and delete single guides. I might also include the ability to link into CL Eraser. If you don't know this tool, it is a tool that I separated out of construction lines a while ago. It's a free add-on. I might put a link below in the description. But it works by being able to drag over geometry, whether it's at object level or in edit mode, and simply delete things like that. So I might include a guide deletion from that. Let's see how that goes. So measurement display is the next item on my list, and that is looking at the way that measurements are displayed in the top bar, and there's a few issues with this. One is that it's just very small. It's hard to see sometimes, and there's quite a lot of information up there. So I want to move this down to a box, maybe down by the toolbar here. I've tried a few different ideas and they didn't work very well, but I will move it down and I'll come up with a solution, maybe put it in a box, a bit like AutoCAD has, because I just want to get the text a bit bigger and I want it to work a bit more smoothly. The other issue with it is that having anything in the top bar means that you remove all of the options up here, and I'd really like to have the different shading options and the different overlays and the ability to change mode up in this the drop down here. I want those in construction lines rather than having to exit and change those things, so I'll move that display. The other thing that I'd like to have is some measurement display actually on the guides or alongside the guides themselves. And it would be optional in the preferences, the ability to turn them off and on, but I think that could be quite useful to have those alongside the guides, and maybe even be able to edit those values to change the size or the length of the guide itself. We'll see how that goes. So a few people have mentioned grid snapping, and although we can't do this at the moment, we can do, as I've shown, the global axes snapping and horizontal guides. So I'm not sure whether we still need this. It could end up being quite intensive sort of processing wise to look at all these grid snap points, but maybe if you leave a comment either below this video or in the Blender Artist forum, I'll put a link to that in the comments, but in the description below. So that's all the major aims for the next release, version 1. I'll post a link to a Trello board which I'm putting together at the moment. I'll have to add it later to the description of this video, but that will outline all of the development that I want to do for the next release in a bit more detail, and there's quite a few extra things I want to add that I haven't gone through today, and also there are things to come after version 1 that I want to eventually add in, so feel free to leave comments. Definitely comment on the Blender Artist forum, and also I've created a new feedback form on the website. Again, I'll leave a link in the description below of that feedback form and an FAQ, which are both on my website. Before I wrap up, just a quick point on Blender version 2.92. I've been testing this a bit recently, and even in normal Blender operation I've been finding a few issues with it. I've had a few crashes, so for a bit more stability I'd recommend using Blender 2.91 for the moment until those things are ironed out. So that's the roundup, and I just want to say thanks to anyone who has bought the add-on, for people who have made comments in the forums or through my website, people who have pointed out bugs that needed fixing. I want to specifically thank Mark Hawkins, Dave Edwards and Mike Tamburello, who all tested this version for me, which is so helpful, because it's very difficult testing your own work, because you know exactly how it should work, you do it in the right way, and it's hard to find a lot of those bugs. So thank you to you guys. As I say, links are in the description below. Thanks for watching the video, and I will catch you in the next one.